Well, hi everyone, and thanks for coming back. This is the last series of lectures we'll be having on epidemiology in this course. And if you remember, last time we talked about using regression models in epidemiology to control for confounding. At the very beginning of those lectures, I said there are really two reasons why we epidemiologists use regression models. One is to control for confounding, that's what we went through last week, and one is to build what we call prediction rules, and that's what I'd like to cover this week. But before I talk about prediction rules, I want to talk about another topic, the topic of screening. Because both screening and prediction rules share a common goal of trying in some sense to predict things among people, characteristics, disease status among people that is unknown at a point in time. That's what screening is trying to do, or might develop in the future. That's what a prediction rule is supposed to be doing. So first let's talk about this concept of screening and screening programs in epidemiology. So first, some definitions or some big pictures about what screening is supposed to accomplish. Screening involves using a simple and inexpensive screening test to give to people, a large number of people who don't have a disease. At least they don't know they have a disease, or they haven't been diagnosed with the disease yet, in order to classify people as likely or unlikely to have that diagnosis. So screening, remember, involves taking people who have not received the diagnosis of, say, a cancer, if that's what you're screening for, or for heart disease, if that's what you're screening for, trying to detect which of those people might have underlying disease, might actually have a cancer, or might actually have heart disease, but unbeknownst to them, because no one's diagnosed it yet. So screening involves looking at healthy people, asymptomatic people without disease, with the goal of classifying them as either being likely or unlikely to have the disease. Now, why are we doing this? Why are we trying to tell people who have no symptoms for cancer or no symptoms for heart disease that you're likely to have this disease? It hasn't been diagnosed yet. Well, the whole goal of the screening program is to hopefully treat those people earlier in their stage of disease so that they'll have better outcomes in the future. So the whole goal of screening is to reduce morbidity and mortality that's associated with that disease that's unknown to them at this point in time by treating people earlier. And hopefully treating people early leads to better outcomes. So that's the goal behind screening. So first of all, let's talk about what type of disease is appropriate to be a candidate for screening. If you think about it, you've probably in your lifetime been screened for certain diseases. If you're a woman of a certain age living in the States, you probably have undergone annual mammograms looking for early signs of breast cancer. Or if you're an older individual, you might have undergone colonoscopies to look at polyps in your colon that might become cancerous in the future, or might even be cancerous. So screening is used typically in populations to identify people who have disease but have not developed the symptoms of those disease. So what type of disease is appropriate for screening? And I would argue, as most people would, it has to be a serious disease in the sense that it has serious consequences. It can lead to ultimately being a reason for dying, or might have prolonged serious morbidity associating. You clearly put into that categories cancers, chronic diseases like heart disease. Those are good candidates for screening. Diseases that could ultimately be fatal, lead to a lot of morbidity. Hopefully find them earlier in their development and treat them earlier to avoid that fatality that might happen to them, or extend a person's lifetime, or to reduce the morbidity that might be associated with it. Now, that's only going to happen if early detection leads to early treatment, and early treatment leads to better outcomes. So not only should it have to be a disease that has serious consequences, it has to have a disease for which we have a treatment. That if we give it to the people early, at an earlier stage of the disease, leads to better outcomes than waiting until that disease is detected symptomatically, and maybe at a later stage of its development. So we want a serious disease, serious consequences, and we have to have a test, if given earlier, leads to better outcomes. And then finally, we have to take into account the cost of a screening test. We want to have a test that is going to be cost efficient in some sense. If I'm a public health professional looking at the health of a community, and I'm saying what sort of diseases should I screen for, Yes, I want to screen for diseases that have serious consequences. I want to screen for disease that earlier treatment leads to better outcomes. But I also want to screen for a disease that exists among a lot of people in my population. So it has to have a high prevalence in my population, a high prevalence in something called the DPCP, the detectable preclinical phase. What do I mean by a detectable preclinical phase? Well, I could break first let's talk about what I mean by a preclinical phase. I can break that into two periods of time. A total preclinical phase and a detectable preclinical phase. And to describe those, I think it's best to look at a picture. So let me skip to the picture for the next time. Let's suppose this is a simple depiction of what happens to a person if they develop a disease. And to make it simple, let's suppose we're talking about breast cancer developing among women. So imagine there's a woman at some point in her life, breast cancer develops. In other words, there's a mutation in cells in her breasts that now says that woman has breast cancer. She doesn't know it, and there's no way we have the technology today maybe to detect it, but there has been some mutation process. The cancer is beginning. So at some point in time, that woman truly has disease, but no one knows about it. It might be weeks later, it might be months later, it might be years later, that person develops symptoms. She might feel a lump in her breast. And those symptoms might lead her to go see a physician. Maybe the next day or maybe the next week, depending on how quickly she can get an appointment. But sometime later, a diagnosis is made that this woman now has breast cancer that's diagnosed. So remember, there's time lags here between the time the disease first developed, the time the symptoms developed, and the time the disease was actually diagnosed. And after that, there would be a time between when the treatment might be given to that woman. It might be the next day, it might be the next week, but sometimes later in her life she receives treatment for her breast cancer. Now let's go back and talk about this preclinical phase. Clinical disease occurs once a person has the symptoms, the signs of having that disease. So I could lay on this the period between when the disease actually develops and the time that the symptoms develop in that person. We can call that the preclinical disease. As far as that woman is concerned, there are no signs, no symptoms of her having breast cancer. As far as she's concerned, she's perfectly healthy. So this period of time, it might be weeks, it might be months, it depends on how quickly the breast cancer is growing to a stage where a lump might be detected when she gives her self-examination. That period of time between the actual onset of disease and the development of symptoms that lead to clinical disease, observable disease, is known as the preclinical phase. That's where screening happens. We screen people who do not have disease, people who do not have symptoms of disease. So when you start screening people for breast cancer, you're talking about women who have not had any symptoms of breast cancer. You're screening in the preclinical phase during this time period between the onset of the disease and the onset of symptoms. So going back to the first slide, the total preclinical phase is the time period between the first development of disease and the development of symptoms. That's the target period for a screening program. Now we want to look at a portion of that total preclinical phase called the detectable preclinical phase. That's where the screening program, the screening test, can detect disease. So going back to that woman we just talked about and talking about the preclinical phase, if we screened a second after the development of the disease in that woman, chances are the mammogram would not be able to detect that particular tumor. It's just too small to detect. So it takes time for the disease to grow, for the cancer to grow, for the screening test to be able to detect it. So part of this total preclinical phase is a point in time where a screening test would not detect disease, even if it did exist. So we could talk now about the detectable preclinical phase. So let's suppose as this cancer grows in a woman's breast, it reaches a point where now the screening test, the mammogram, could detect it. Now you're entering the detectable preclinical phase. You're still pre-symptomatic, you're still in the preclinical phase, but now you're entering a point in time where the screening test can detect it. That's what we mean by the detectable preclinical phase. It begins at the point in time when the screening test could detect the disease and ends again when the symptoms are. That's the point where the screening test is going to have some benefit. It works in that detectable preclinical phase. Now, when we come back, I want to talk about a screening test first, and then a screening program that's going to be applied in this detectable preclinical phase. But let's first talk about the screening test. That'll be the focus of the next lecture. See you then.